Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really well. Today we are going to be doing a new episode of the Let's Edit series. If you haven't seen the other episodes in this series, I'll put a link in the description. Today, a huge thank you to our volunteer and my Patreon supporter, Morgan Trainer. She's allowing us to look at the first chapter of her fantasy novel. So just as a quick reminder, in this video series, I'm going to be doing line editing with a little bit of developmental editing, but I'm not going to be doing any proofreading or spell checking, punctuation, things like that I'm not going to be doing. And of course, I have a limited knowledge of the novel. I haven't read the whole thing. This is all that I know. So some of my suggestions may be a little bit looser than they would be if I were, say, familiar with the entire story. I also want to do a quick reminder just to say that please be kind in the comments. Of course, this is all about constructive criticism. This series is intended to be constructive criticism, but just make sure that it is, in fact, constructive and that what you're saying is as kind as possible. And I know that the volunteers really appreciate that. And I think that about covers it. So let's go ahead and jump in. I couldn't hear any cars through my open window. I couldn't smell exhaust or hear the sounds of sirens that should have been screaming at all hours. In fact, I was pretty sure my window wasn't open at all. Strange that, and the sheets, they felt too soft. My fingers clenched on the comforter. Why was I sleeping on my back? I never slept on my back. I think this is a nice, intriguing opening paragraph. My only thought is that it's maybe not entirely clear that her eyes aren't open. So when you say that she can't hear various things through the window, my assumption was that she was looking at the open window, not that her eyes were closed and she didn't realize that the window wasn't open at all. So that could be just a little bit jarring, so that's something that you might want to consider. But I think that overall this definitely raises intrigue, which is something that's really nice to see in the first paragraph. You might also consider changing the sound of sirens that should have been screaming at all hours to instead reference the specific time of day, which would help orient the reader. Right now, I don't know if she's woken up in the middle of the night or if it's in the early morning. For example, you could change it to something like the sound of sirens that always screamed even this early in the morning or even in the middle of the night. You do indicate it's night in the next paragraph, but orienting us faster would help us to feel as readers more rooted in the character's experience, especially combined with adding that her eyes are closed. Those two pieces of additional information would give us a much stronger idea of what she's experiencing. As I sat up, I frowned. I looked down at my hands in the dim light of the night. To me, I frowned is sort of filler here. I don't think it's really needed. It's not clear if she's frowning at the whole situation or at her hands specifically, which is partly why it stands out to me. It's not entirely clear what it's referring to, but I don't think it's really adding anything either way. I think this would read smoother if combined with the next sentence, I sat up and looked down at my hands in the dim light of the night. A light that changed colors slightly even as I stared down at the impossible, tiny. So the phrasing here is just a little bit confusing. I think it's not entirely clear what type of light you're talking about. Are we talking about artificial light, interior light? Are we talking about light coming in through the windows? So normally a phrase like in the dim light of the night would refer to something like ambient light, like natural light. I think you might be referring to artificial light, so I would consider clarifying the light source. Lastly, as I stared down at the impossible tiny is a little confusing. I get what you mean, but it feels a little bit sloppy because the paragraph goes from describing her hands to describing the light, then back to her hands without a smooth transition. I would maybe play around with having her sort of look around the room and examine the room first. So right now it reads almost like she sits up and immediately looks at her hands. And it's not that I don't like her realizing that her hands aren't her own. I think that's a nice, impactful moment. But I think you could get two impactful moments here while also making it feel a bit more natural. So if we wake up and we don't think that we're where we went to bed, so we're not familiar with where we are, I think we're going to look around ourselves first before we start looking at our hands or looking at our own body. So I think it would be nice if she looked around the room. It would give you some space to describe the room as well. And then you could almost have these two impactful moments. One, realizing she isn't where she fell asleep and this isn't her bedroom. And then another interesting, impactful moment when she realizes this isn't even her own body. So it sort of doubles up on that. And I also think it will just feel a little bit more natural. Where had the long fingers gone that could play ninths with ease, that had mastered some of the most difficult piano pieces of my life? They were gone. I would probably cut "they were gone" as it doesn't add any additional information. We already know she's looking at different hands than her own. I looked around the room, but nothing looked like my crappy, affordable apartment. This looked like something like rooms I saw in magazines. This seems unnecessarily wordy. I would probably cut this down to "this looked like something from a magazine." I would also try to get rid of the repetition of "looked." Fancy wallpaper, four-poster bed with a canopy, a writing table, luscious drapes around the windows, 2 couches in a sitting area, a small table with 2 chairs. Were those 2 glass doors leading to a balcony? Like I mentioned earlier, I would probably describe the room earlier on in the chapter. So I think what you could do is have her describe the room twice. So the first time could be a little bit more panicked, of a sort of, I don't know where I am, things are different, this isn't where I went to bed. Then have her realization about her body's not even her body, and then have a slower, more thoughtful realization or description of all the different things in the room. So a bit of a more significant understanding of the new environment. So sort of a panicked description of the room, a description of her realizing her body isn't her own body, and then a bit of a slower description of the room that gives us a little bit more detail. So that's just something that I would try. You don't strictly have to, but that's something that I think might feel a bit more natural and also give you a little bit more space to bring across those details. "Where am I?" I asked the empty room. No one answered, at first. "My lady, you're awake." My soul nearly left my body in surprise. I shrieked. A head had poked up beside the bed, like straight out of a nightmare. "My soul nearly left my body" feels a bit cliche. The cliche could work as part of the narrator's voice, but I don't have a good sense of what her voice is like right now and whether this reflects who she is or is just a cliche. I also think "like straight out of a nightmare" seems a bit cliche as well, so there's a little bit of a compounding effect. I honestly think you could cut this down to just "a head poked up beside the bed, I shrieked." The girl sang a series of odd, disjointed intervals, and the lights in the room came on. When I squinted at them more closely, I realized they were actually glowing crystals attached to the walls in an artful manner, like a bouquet that had been set into a metal casing. Firstly, the girl doesn't react to the narrator shrieking at her, which seems a little odd. I'd think she'd either laugh or apologize or scowl or whatever would best reflect her personality, but the complete lack of reaction I think feels a little bit odd here. Secondly, if these crystals are the source of the light at the beginning of the chapter, I think she would have noticed that the light source was crystals at that point. Our eyes tend to go sort of right to unexpected light sources. And lastly, I assume there's more than one of these bouquets on the walls. It's not entirely clear from the wording. You say the crystals are attached to the walls plural, but that it's like a bouquet singular, which is where the confusion is coming from. What the hell, I thought. My mind had identified the pitches and thus the intervals that had been sung the moment I heard them, the curse of perfect pitch, really, but I couldn't reconcile the fact that music had a direct correlation with turning on bedroom lights, and such unpleasant-sounding music at that. 12-tone row, really? And not done well like Schoenberg or Copland, more like a child hitting random keys on a piano. So I don't think it's entirely clear or entirely convincing that the singing is what turned on the lights. I think someone from our world, from how the world normally works, would probably need a lot more convincing to believe something like this were true. I don't think that we would only need one piece of evidence and one song one time that turns the light on once and then we would believe that it worked. I think we would need a little bit more convincing to think that something like that is possible or plausible. For example, you could add a small moment like, "Oh, that's a bit too bright," the girl said, and she sang another series of notes and the lights dimmed. This would show without a doubt that she is controlling the lights with singing. I would also pay attention to her reaction here and what it says about her as a person. I think "what the hell" is a bit generic, and it could probably be cut with no impact on the reader's interpretation. Most importantly, with this passage, I would take a look at her mentioning the curse of perfect pitch. I think that this early on, when we don't really know anything about the character and we're just starting to get to know her, this could come across almost like a humble brag. It sort of has that vibe of how, "Oh, I'm so beautiful that it disrupts my life," that type of character. I think this sort of seems like maybe tipping into arrogant. I don't know entirely that that's not what you're going for, it's possible that you do want to go with that. I would just be conscious of that to make sure that is a connotation that you want for the character, because I think perfect pitch mostly is a thing that I think a lot of people would really like to have. So her saying it's a curse, it just kind of maybe feels a little bit like bragging or a little bit like arrogance. With the increased light, I turned my attention back to the girl and her unnaturally colored hair. Platinum lilac, really? How much must that have cost? And to do her eyelashes, too, seemed a bit much. And was she wearing contacts to get that orange hue to her eyes? But who would wear contacts to sleep? The odd-looking girl is an interesting element here, and I like that. I think the narrator's reaction to her, the way that she describes her, I think feels maybe a little bit too judgmental. I don't know if, again, that maybe is intentional, maybe that's part of her characterization, but I think the focus on how much must it have cost to have her hair dyed, I would be concerned maybe that tips into unnecessarily critical. A lot of people dye their hair. I don't think the cost of hair dye is something that we typically think of in real life when we see someone with an unnatural colored hair. Whether we like it or not, I don't think that our thought is that it must have cost a lot of money, and so it just maybe comes across as a little bit unnecessarily judgmental. Again, it's possible that's intentional, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about how you might go about this opening chapter if you are trying to go for an arrogant vibe. But I just wanted to make sure that that is something that you want here, because I think she is coming across a little bit arrogant and a little bit judgmental. Not severely, it's not extreme, it's not making her like totally unlikable or anything like that, but I think it's possible that you don't intend it to come across in the way that it is coming across. So I would consider what you want to bring across right away about her personality and consider replacing this with something less judgmental if appropriate. My lady, are you okay? The girl, no, young woman, sat up further and hovered at my bedside. Sat up further implies she's still sitting down, but hovered to me implies movement, so this description feels a little bit contradictory. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her hands twitched against the soft lilac bedding that glowed almost blue with the artificial crystal lights. I assumed the crystals were natural and not artificial. I would probably clarify this earlier if you want the reader to see the crystals as a decorative choice rather than the way the lights actually work, or just that they just work with crystals. And I'm really not sure. Maybe you mean that the lighting just seems artificial to her, not that it's made of artificial crystals, but I would clarify that. I think I had a strange dream. I brought a hand up to my head, but nothing started magically making sense. I get what you mean here, but I think it might help to add something like I brought a hand up to my head to help me think, but nothing started magically making sense. To me, her believing that her true life or her real life was just a dream, it doesn't entirely ring true to me. I think it would take a lot more convincing or a lot more time, a lot more space to think that what feels like her real life is actually a dream. I think more likely she would react more panicked, like, how did I get here? What's happening? I think she may, even accuse the girl of somehow causing this to happen or asking if somebody else caused this to happen. I don't know that she would so quickly move into thinking that it was a dream, just because that's a whole life that feels real to her, and I think it would take a lot more time and space to come to that conclusion. I was a concert pianist. My name was Fiona Lacombe. I had just finished a performance at the Four Seasons in Toronto when it was a blank. You hit your head rather hard when you fell from your horse, my lady, but the doctor gave you a clean bill of health after he healed your concussion. She shook her head and started fidgeting even more fretfully with my sheets like she itched to do something. What? I stared at her. And who called medical treatment getting healed in this day and age? I said it was too soon after the great melting to ride, but you insisted, she continued, as if that was what I had been confused about, rather than the fact that I might go on a horse at all when I didn't know how to ride one. The muck was too thick on the trail, and you fell against the base of a tree when the horse stumbled, my lady. So a couple things about the dialogue that I think would help a lot. So firstly, it would really help if you gave her, the narrator, more space to react. So if you gave her more instances where she was able to verbally respond, that would make the dialogue more engaging. It would also give you more room to depict her as a character and depict her reactions, and it would just in general come across as more natural. Secondly, you have a tendency to separate the reactions from the input. So she gets some kind of input, somebody says something or does something, and then her reaction is spaced a little bit too far apart. This makes it just hard enough for the reader to follow the dialogue. It's not even so much that it makes it hard, it just makes it harder, that it just adds a little bit more of a barrier. So I think if you could have her react closer to when she hears a certain piece of dialogue, that would help tremendously with clarity, and it would also make the reading experience a lot smoother. So, for example, this passage could be reworked to something like, "You hit your head rather hard when you fell from your horse, my lady." Here's where I would break up the dialogue more to give her more time to react. "What?" I stared at her. I had never been on a horse in my life. Notice I also moved the reaction to riding the horse closer to when the horse is first mentioned. "But don't worry, the doctor healed you." Healed? Who called medical treatment getting healed in this day and age? Healed what? Notice here again, I moved her reaction to healed to closer to what she's reacting to, and also gave her more room to participate in the conversation. "Your concussion." I touched the back of my head. None of this made any sense. I added just a bit of extra introspection here to help the reader track her feelings through the conversation. She shook her head and started fidgeting even more fretfully with my sheets, like she itched to do something. "I said it was too soon after the great melting to ride, but you insisted." Here I moved the placement of her fidgeting to around the part of the conversation about the concussion to better imply that she's concerned about its severity. You could, of course, move this reaction to closer to whatever you want to imply she's reacting to, but that's just my guess in terms of what you intended. I blinked. Great melting? I also moved her reaction to the term great melting to right after it was mentioned to improve clarity. "The muck was too thick on the trail and you fell against the base of a tree when the horse stumbled, my lady." While not radically different, I hope you can see how placing the characters' reactions closer to what they're reacting to helps with clarity, as does giving more room for natural verbal reactions to each new piece of information. This allows the reader to follow her reactions and her thought process more closely, which increases connection to her and makes the scene easier to follow. I found myself looking down at my hands again as my thoughts raced. Those tiny, wretchedly unfamiliar things. Where are the ones I insured for $1 million and then couldn't afford a better apartment? Again, we are getting to know her for the first time, and her talking about insuring her hands for $1 million gives off a little bit of an arrogant vibe. Again, that might be intentional, it might not be intentional. I just thought I would mention it in case it's not what you're going for. So I want to talk a little bit about what you could do if you are trying to go for an arrogant character. So if you do want her to be coming across as a little bit arrogant or a little entitled or spoiled or whatever, normally if we are going to do that, what we want to do is establish them in their normal life first. So usually if we're going to have a character who goes from a trait like arrogance to being less arrogant, especially when you introduce some sort of it doesn't have to be a fantasy element, but some sort of element where they're in a new environment. So basically we're talking about a fish out of water story. We normally want to establish their regular life first. So we normally want to see them in their normal environment where they're benefiting from being arrogant and they're getting some sort of reward, or there's some sort of positive result of that arrogance. So maybe they're surrounded by people who admire them and everybody thinks that they're amazing, and so they get sort of a big head, and then they're plopped into this new environment, and in this environment that arrogance doesn't pay off, or it doesn't matter, or nobody really cares and nobody's really impressed, and then we see them sort of floundering trying to deal with that new environment. Usually with any fish out of water story, even if you're not going for arrogance, we typically want to see a setup of the character in their ordinary life. This helps us to get a better idea of how their traits usually work for them, especially their negative traits or their false belief, the thing that they're going to have to overcome. Normally we want to see those consequences develop in the new environment, and we want to see in the old environment how those consequences didn't exist or how things were beneficial for them. So I think you're putting yourself in a bit of a tricky situation by not establishing this character earlier, by not having a scene before this scene where we get to know her ordinary life. You don't strictly have to do that. Another option might be to start with this scene, cut it a bit earlier, so cut out a lot of, we haven't gotten to all the other things that happen, but cut out a lot of like the back end elements of this scene to include a flashback of her ordinary life so that we get both. And then you can go back to this scene or pick this scene up and extend it a bit so that we sort of get the hook of this new body, but we also get some sense of what her regular life was like. That might not make any sense with the premise, or it might not work with the premise. Again, I don't know anything about this story other than this chapter, but it's something that you might want to consider. I think some of the awkwardness of this opening chapter is going to come from the fact that we really don't know who this character is, and this is quite a complicated situation to start a novel with. They were gone, replaced with these imposters, childlike hands, somehow unnaturally small. This basically just repeats what was already explained earlier, so I don't think that it seems necessary. A larger, warmer hand took my clammy one. It squeezed gently. "Did you have a nightmare, my lady?" This reaction seems slightly confusing because she already told the girl that she had a strange dream a few moments ago, so it's not clear why she would ask this now as if she doesn't know, or as if the concept of dreaming was coming up for the first time. Her voice sounded wrong now that I thought of it. It wasn't English she was speaking, but I understood her just fine. As soon as I caught the glitch in the Matrix, my mind couldn't let it go. Glitch in the Matrix feels modern and voice heavy, which is absolutely fine, but I don't think it's quite clear enough if this is intentional, if it's part of what you're going for. And as a result, the phrasing currently stands out as just a little bit more voice heavy and a little bit more modern than everything else or all the rest of the narration. So it's perfectly fine to go voice heavy. I would just make sure that you're keeping it kind of consistent. Then the memories flooded as pain erupted inside my skull. It feels like a word is missing here. Memories flooded back, I think, would read smoother. No, I was not this Fiona Lacombe. I was Juliana d'Art, daughter of Duke Faunus d'Art. I was a noble lady, not a concert pianist. What was a piano? Suddenly I felt as though I had split in two sets of memories warred for dominance. I really like the idea of two sets of memories warring for dominance. I think that's a really interesting concept, and I'm not at all the type of person who is fundamentally against ever using any telling whatsoever, but I do think you could show this a little bit more. I think you could give us a better impression of what this is like internally, what it feels like, what she's experiencing. I think that would really help us to connect with her a bit better. And I think that there would be a lot more immersion for the reader. My lady, Henrietta's voice gained a slight tremor. The doctor said you shouldn't have any head pain waking up. Should I have your father summon him again? I think the phrasing, the doctor said you shouldn't have any head pain waking up, reads just a tiny bit awkward. I would probably reword this just to make it flow a little better. I blinked. Then I squeezed my eyes shut. I don't think I blinked as adding anything. It just sort of feels like filler to me. Perhaps, if I just went back to sleep, I would wake up to long, muscular hands with knobbly knuckles like I was used to. I think like I was used to adds wordiness without changing the meaning, so I'd cut it. I longed to play something, anything, to prove to myself it wasn't all a dream. Perhaps if I could sleep, I would return to a simple life, preparing to be a good wife under the unforgiving tutelage of my mother. Shame filled me as I remembered my failing over and over again to understand and cast the simplest of magic spells. So this part lost me a little bit, and I don't know if it's just me. You guys will have to let me know in the comments if this made sense to you, but I found it a little confusing that she wanted to go to sleep to wake up to her piano playing hands, to her regular life, to what feels like her real life, but now all of a sudden she wants to go to sleep to wake up in what seems like the life she's already in. So it seems like she wants to wake up as the person she already is having her experience as. So to me, that's a little bit confusing. I don't really understand why she feels like if she went to sleep, she'd be in a different scenario, but she'd still be the same character. That's just a little bit confusing. Maybe what you mean is that she is hoping to wake up as this character that she currently is, or as this person in this fantasy world, but in a more normal scenario, so without her current disorientation. I'm not entirely sure. I think this is a little bit confusing, and I think it could be altered or reworded to help the reader to understand a little bit better what she's actually experiencing. No, it's all right. I turned a meek smile towards Henrietta, the retainer I had had by my side my entire life, literally. She slept by my side on the trundle bed that was rolled underneath my bed's frame before I got up every morning. This Fiona business would be gone by morning, I was sure. I think I shall try to go back to sleep now. Her reaction to Henrietta's question feels spaced too far from the question, which can cause the reader to not remember what she's reacting to. It seems like now at this point she's come to accept that this fantasy world is her real life and that the other life is a dream or isn't real or is some kind of illusion. I think you need a stronger transition into now believing that this is her real life. Because right now I feel like it's a bit jarring. It almost feels like similar to head hopping, how all of a sudden we're in one character's head and then in another character's head. There's a little bit of a jarringness and a lack of clarity in why she transitions into thinking now that this is her real life and that her life as a pianist was, not real, an illusion, whatever. I would create a much stronger transition, sort of walk us through the thought process here, or walk us through how perhaps this world is sort of coming into clarity as the more real one for her in some way. I just don't think right now it's as clear as it could be. It's certainly a tricky thing to try to accomplish without a doubt, but I think right now it's maybe a little bit hard to completely grasp. Except I couldn't sleep. Not really. Instead, I found my mind racing back and forth between two different lives, trying to reconcile them. I had over 30 years of experience as Fiona rattling around in my head, and at the same time, I had 12 years as Juliana. I actually didn't think that she was in a child's body, like an actual child. I thought that her hands were just small and she was sort of offended by the small hands because she's used to having big hands. Maybe I'm alone in that and no one else would have thought that, but it didn't occur to me that she was literally in a child's body. With that said, I also would not have guessed that the adult character was in her 30s. I would have guessed early 20s at the latest, and only because you mentioned her having an apartment. Otherwise, I probably would have guessed she was more like 15, 16. There are a few different reasons for this. Firstly, I think first person fundamentally makes it harder for characters to feel adult. I think there's something about first person, the way that it conveys thoughts and feelings, the way it conveys the narration, that I think it's just a little bit harder to make characters feel mature, to feel like adults. I also think that her sort of arrogance or her slightly judgmental attitude feels more teen, and again, I'm not sure whether or not that's intentional. It may be not intentional, in which case even more so I would try to eliminate that, but I think that gives a little bit of a high school vibe. The other thing is she seems a little bit shy or maybe a little bit nervous about speaking out. And I think that an adult, someone in their 30s, I think would more likely have thoughts of, have I been drugged? Is this some kind of experiment? Like, did you guys do this to me? Like, what's going on? And I think she just she sits back in the situation a little bit more than what I would expect from someone in their 30s. I would expect her to just be a little bit, not necessarily aggressive, but a little bit more dominant in the situation, especially considering her her character who is taking care of her, I can't remember, the young girl that in this story, I cannot remember her name, I apologize. I have a mashed potato brain right now. I'm 7 months pregnant. I feel that she would be more dominant with her because she's younger, if that makes sense. So I feel like she wouldn't be as intimidated as she seems. Yes, she's disoriented, but I think she's almost giving off a vibe that she's intimidated or nervous or shy of saying or doing anything. Lastly, I think she also could have a little bit more mature concerns. I think her concerns are mostly wanting to be able to play piano or wanting to live in that life where she has that skill and that ability. I think it feels a little bit single-focused perhaps for someone in their 30s. So maybe it would be helpful to have her worry about a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a pet or her parents or some other responsibility. I think the fact that she's only really thinking about wanting to play piano and wanting her piano hands back and wanting, to live in that aspect of her life, it feels a little one-dimensional for her age, and I would think I think it might help to have her concerned about something else or someone else to create a little bit of a heightened sense of maturity. By the time the morning arrived, my head was a complete mess. I'm not sure if this is really any different than the night before. I think you could create some contrast with how she felt before going to sleep, or you could have her come to a new conclusion. Otherwise, there really isn't any purpose behind having her go back to sleep. My lady, I really do think it would be best to call the doctor, Henrietta said softly as she checked my temperature. You're so pale, and you sweat straight through your sheets through the night. I'll have to change all the bedding. The bedding, right. I'm not exactly sure what the implication is of her reaction, the bedding, right? It just seems a bit like filler to me. It doesn't have a clear meaning or connotation. Also, it might be regional, I'm not sure, but sweat as the past tense of sweat seems off to me. I would say sweated. I don't know if that is regional, but I just thought I would mention that. I would also cut the repetition of through. I clenched my hands on the two damp sheets that still felt far too soft. Whatever you think is best, Henrietta, I finally said. I would cut two from too damp to avoid the repetition of two. Somehow that made her look even more worried. At this point, she seems to remember quite a bit about this life. So because of that, I'm wondering if she could provide a little bit more insight on Henrietta, a little bit more insight on what she's like and, what her reactions mean or something about their relationship. I just think she could provide a little bit more information and a little bit more context to who Henrietta is, given the fact that she seems to have regained quite a bit of memories of this life. I'll be right back, she murmured quietly before disappearing with such swiftness that I was left alone in my surprise. I stared up at the ceiling while she was gone. Who am I? The ceiling didn't have an answer. I closed my eyes. Phantom sensations came to me. I felt smooth piano keys under my fingertips. I felt a firm needle under my fingers embroidering flowers. I felt my hot travel mug in my hand. I delicately held a cup of china that looked so thin that if I placed it down too hard on the plate, it might crack. I like the repetition of the phrasing with the different things that she remembers, but to make this read smoother, I would keep consistent with the pattern of I felt smooth piano keys, I felt a firm needle, I felt my hot travel mug. I delicately held breaks that pattern and unfortunately makes the paragraph feel a little bit clunky. Despite the very slightly clunky wording going on in this paragraph, this is the type of showing I was referring to before when I said it would be really nice to show more what it's like that she has these two memories or these two lives that are sort of competing in her mind. I think this does a much better job of showing what that experience is actually like. I would really like to see more of this type of showing, or even maybe moving this showing, this paragraph of showing earlier on would be an option as well. But I think this does a really good job of helping us to sort of feel out what the experience is actually like. Besides that, I think at this point, the scene is starting to feel a little bit slow. I think perhaps it would make sense to cut things down a bit. I don't know that she needs to have quite the extensive conversations with Henrietta. It feels like that could sort of be condensed. Not a crazy amount. I don't think you need to cut like half the scene or anything, but I think it just feels a little bit slow. It feels a little bit long, and I don't think that it's moving as quickly as what would be beneficial. I felt the warm, stinging itch of tears before I realized I was crying. They tickled as they slithered down my cheeks. Tickled and slithered feel a little contradictory to me as sensations. I'm just overtired. I silently dismissed it all, wiping them away with hands that still felt too small, yet at the same time familiar. Them is ambiguous here. Obviously, I know you're referring to the tears, but it reads awkwardly. I just replace it with the tears. They were my hands, yet another's. I couldn't tell how much time passed before two men entered the room. One I knew immediately to be my father. The other I only had the vaguest memories of. Juliana, dear, how are you feeling? Father asked with a concerned look on his face. I would cut on his face because it's not needed. I think you could probably cut concerned look altogether because I think it's obvious enough, but it's okay either way. His silver hair was longer on the top and combed to one side, while his beard reminded me of that rich guy making the flying suits in whatever superhero movie that was. This is kind of a confusing description, especially if you're not sure what movie this refers to, which I'm not. It also, again, feels more voice-heavy than the rest of the narration. I think the narration is just feeling a little bit inconsistent. Paired with his bright orange eyes and four-piece suit, he looked distinguished. This is a sentence fragment. I get what you mean, but it's a tad awkward. I stared at him blearily as affection at the sight of him curled in my chest. Using both stared at him and sight of him feels a little redundant. My head hurts. The moment I said it, he sat on the edge of the bed, and that large, warm, and safe hand landed on my forehead. It was huge, so huge that I felt like it could shield me from anything. It's totally up to you, but I think it might be nice to contrast her feelings about this version of her's father with the fact that she's an adult. So maybe she feels like she shouldn't really feel this way. She doesn't really know this man, and she's an adult. I think you could show a little bit of those warring feelings here in a way that I think would be particularly interesting. Again, it's totally up to you. And also, like I mentioned, I'm not entirely sure that I completely understand what she's supposed to know about both worlds at any given point. So I'm not sure if at this point her knowledge of her previous life or her other life is sort of faded away. But if it's not, I think it might be an interesting place to also add a little bit of a more mature perspective that as an adult, she really shouldn't be wanting the comfort of her father in this way, or something along those lines. I think it might be an interesting way to show how those two personalities are different from each other. It feels a mess, I whined softly under the umbrella of that hand, and I'm exhausted. A mess? The doctor asked with a frown. Then he hummed a long, meandering tune before holding a hand to the side of my head. It felt a little tender. The meaning of this is unclear. Is a little tender good or bad? Like the doctor is maybe familiar with her, or only a little tender with her, like he isn't familiar with her. It's not exactly clear what you mean. His frown deepened. There is some inflammation, swelling, that was not present when I left yesterday, he muttered. Then he sang another song, except it didn't sound like a real song. No, it sounded like an absolute mess of different pitches. I don't really think this description is strictly necessary since you've already clarified that these songs aren't really songs. You could simplify it to something like, then he sang another jumble of notes. As I heard each one, I identified them with letter names in sharps and flats that seemed strangely foreign yet familiar. Do you mean that he's singing notes that don't exist in reality, or do you mean the combination specifically feels foreign and also familiar? This could just be a little bit clearer. When it brought with it a cooling effect on my skull, I let loose a sigh of relief. Then I had a moment of clarity. Magic, right. He was casting magic with sound rather than with wand movements or words. I got the impression she was already conscious of this, that this was already clear to her, so this seems a little bit unneeded. In fact, even though talking used pitch, it didn't seem to trigger magic phenomena. I get what you mean here, but to me this just doesn't really seem needed. The analytical thoughts were soon pushed away by the overwhelming relief and soothing coolness that seemed to fill my skull from one end to the other. I felt like I could fall straight asleep. This feels a little redundant since you already described the cooling effect and the relief. When the doctor finally finished his magic, he sat back in the chair that Henrietta must have placed for him at the bedside. It wasn't there a moment ago. I don't think this last sentence is needed. I think the reader can infer it wasn't there before by her thinking that Henrietta must have placed it there. Has the fall caused any permanent damage then? Father asked as he finally pulled that warm, safe hand from my forehead. I felt myself missing it immediately. Hard to tell, the doctor said quietly, as though I wouldn't hear him even though I was right there and fully conscious. I thought I had all of it yesterday. I checked twice. It is strange for other symptoms to appear after our treatment is complete. What do you suggest? The doctor sighed. I will come visit for the next 3 days to check up on her, just to be safe. Do not let her cast any magic for now. Of course. I blinked sleepily at them. I wasn't even sure I could do magic. So confusing. I would cut so confusing because you're showing that already, so the telling isn't really adding anything. The memories of Juliana told me I was terrible at it, and the memories of Fiona told me that magic wasn't real and notes were easy. However, I had memorized that healing spell with little effort. How could I not memorize such a simple tune? This is confusing. I don't know what you're trying to say exactly. She seems to both think she did and didn't memorize this spell. But learning spells is impossibly hard, but memorizing music by ear is so easy. Those were the last conflicting thoughts I had before the doctor put me to sleep with another tune that my brain caught like a moth in a net. So overall, I think that this is a pretty good opening chapter. It has a lot of intrigue. It's really interesting and exciting. The main thing that I would recommend is that it may be difficult in the long run to pull off alternating between these two characters, having both of their personalities be sort of equally prominent. It might make more sense to have one be the prominent, probably the adult personality be the predominant personality, and to have the other personality sort of almost interfering with or interrupting the thoughts. That would help to differentiate the two. You don't have to do it that way. I do like the idea of the two personalities sort of battling to be at the forefront, or the two memories more like trying to battle for the forefront, but I think because we need to establish a strong connection to a main character, it does have that effect of feeling like we're trying to connect with and bond with two characters at once. We're trying to understand two characters at once. And that's definitely a little bit tricky, especially for an opening chapter. I don't know how the rest of the story plays out. I don't know whether it would make sense to maybe introduce the characters separately, to have them have introductory paragraphs before their minds or their lives sort of clash. But again, I just don't know what the premise is here or how this will eventually play out. But if it's possible to at least establish one of the characters in advance, I think that would potentially help. Again, you could use this opening as a hook and then move more quickly into a chapter that orients us to the adult character and then come back to this. Again, you could use a flashback for that so that you know it would make sense with the plot, it would make sense with how things play out. That's just an idea or a recommendation. I don't think it's so much that you can't do it the way that you're trying to do it, but I do think there's going to be a lot of struggle, a lot of pitfalls that you'll have to be aware of and pay attention to. When it comes to the writing itself, I think this is very close to working well. I think you have a couple of very minor things, like I mentioned. You have a tendency to separate reactions a little bit too far from the input. That can be a little bit confusing. It can make it hard to fully track the scene for the reader. And I think the adult character could come across as a little bit more mature, and maybe that judgmentalness or that arrogance isn't intentional. But other than that, I think you're doing really well here. There's just a few little things that I think kind of stack up a little bit more, so they end up being a little bit more of a problem than they really are. They're relatively easy things to solve. So those are my recommendations for you. Definitely, if you're watching, let her know in the comments what your thoughts are, what you liked, didn't like, what you thought worked and didn't work. And again, please be kind and constructive with that. So when you guys are watching this video, I believe that my baby should already be born. Right now I'm 7 months pregnant, but I'm filming this in advance. So I just want to say thank you so much to my Patreon supporters for supporting me through maternity leave. It means so much to me to be able to take a maternity leave with my daughter. And if you do want to help support on Patreon, I do have some pre-recorded things on there that will be coming out throughout maternity leave, but of course I will be less active on there. But you can still get my cheat sheets and you can join us on Discord and all of those things. So if that's interesting to you, you can check that out. I'll put the link in the description. So I will be back with a new video in about, I think, 6 weeks. And in the meantime, happy writing, guys.